Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be in the South because when you say good morning or good afternoon, the audience responds collectively. I like that. First of all, let me thank Dean Edward Rubin for the wonderful introduction. And I'd like to thank the Robert Penn Warren Center and especially Mona Fredericks for the invitation to participate in this important event that simultaneously commemorates the 40th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and the 20th anniversary, as I understand it, of the establishment of the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities. And I understand this is also the, as you said, the 2008 Birch Lecture. So let me say that I am really honored to participate in a program that includes so many distinguished speakers, and especially Reverend James Lawson, whom I see there. I look forward to hearing your talk tomorrow. And other participants, Houston Baker, Richard King, Ruth Turner Perot. And I want to begin by saying that I have never really felt compelled to participate in that exercise of memory that is designed to persuade us as individuals that we too tread the terrain of history. We try to forge bonds that tie our own individual personalities to those cascades of historical events that otherwise disregard our minor existences and occupations. We emphasize, for example, the gravity of the attacks on September 11, 2001, by constantly recounting where we were and what we were doing when we learned about the Twin Towers. Let me say that during the 1960s, violence on the domestic scene, especially assassinations, became so commonplace that our responses tended to be that of a community under siege. Of course, there were conspiracy rumors circulating around the deaths of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, and of course Martin Luther King. Many people were absolutely certain that the government was involved in all of these deaths. And if it wasn't, then the assassins, whoever they might be, were doing the work of sinister forces within the U.S. government. So those of us who are old enough to have witnessed this epidemic of assassinations were confronted with perhaps too many moments inviting us to incorporate our own lives into lasting historical memory. And as I said, while I don't often engage in this exercise, reflecting on this day, April 4th, did produce an irresistible flow of personal memories. And I describe them to you this afternoon, not because I wish to write myself into that history, but rather because I think we desperately need to complicate the dominant discourse on Dr. Martin Luther King, which has unfortunately been reduced to a narrative about a single individual who had a dream of equality and democracy, a dream that was subsequently transformed into our contemporary social reality. And I should say that just before I left the hotel, I saw John McCain speaking at the Lorraine Hotel. And what was interesting was that he admitted that he had made a horrible mistake when he refused to support the establishment of a King holiday. And then the crowd, under their umbrellas, apparently responded in unison, "We forgive you." So, but I should get back to my notes. And I was about to tell you where I was on April 4th, 1968. I was in Los Angeles, and I was spending all of the time I wasn't devoted to my studies working with the Los Angeles chapter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And when I learned about the assassination, I was running off leaflets for a community protest. And what might be important for you to know was that while I was incredulous and distraught, as were all of my comrades in SNCC, we knew then that we had to urgently consider the consequences of Dr. King's murder for the work we were doing in Los Angeles. We absolutely knew that if a response to the assassination were not organized, after all, this was the man who epitomized nonviolence in every aspect of his life and work, then there would probably be a mass spontaneous outpouring of rage. And we knew that the police were anxious to demonstrate that they now knew how to quash urban rebellions. Remember, this is 3 years after the Watts Rebellion. Exactly 1 year prior to Dr. King's assassination, he had delivered his well-known speech on Vietnam at the Riverside Church in New York. And parenthetically, we might ask ourselves why the dream speech has overshadowed in popular discourse all the more complex analyses he attempted to present. And for example, in the Riverside speech. So at Riverside, King spoke thinking about the long string of urban rebellions that had occurred over the last 2 years. He said, he spoke about, and I'm quoting, "My experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they asked, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without first having spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of these boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent." And so this was the king we were mourning. And we knew that he was considered a menace to the government, although now, of course, he's perhaps the most important figure in the pantheon of U.S. democracy, and as we know, is praised by progressives and conservatives alike. And so we decided to declare a day of mourning in Los Angeles on April 5th. And I should say that we were a group of maybe 40 or 50 young people doing work in the black community in Los Angeles, and we had the audacity to declare a day of mourning for the entire city. And we took ourselves seriously. And so we decided that we would make sure that all businesses shut down in honor of Dr. King's memory. And so we Xerox, I keep saying Xerox, but I don't mean that because that technology wasn't available at that time. We mimeographed, which was a lot harder, right? We mimeographed over 100,000 flyers and circulated them in the business districts, especially in South Central Los Angeles, but in other parts of the city as well. But through our contacts, and we did have contacts who could tell us what was happening inside the police department, through our contacts we learned that the LAPD was preparing for a riot. Apparently they had developed many new weapons in the aftermath of Watts and saw this as an opportunity to use them. And so we dispatched our people to every major black neighborhood in the city with the goal of recruiting people to demand that every business, large and small, shut down. And it was interesting because most of them complied and they placed signs in their windows. It was a little bit harder for the big mall department stores, like, you know, the May Company. And so we put up a huge picket line outside of the several malls. Now, what were the police doing while we were involved in our nonviolent organizing efforts? They had placed high-power machine guns on the roof of the main police station in LA. There were many provocations, including an attack on a young black man who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he was dumped off at our office, totally bloody, seriously injured. And we read that as an attempt to provoke us to respond in such a way that would give them an opportunity to attack our office. And indeed, while we were out in the field on that day, April 5th, the police did break into our office. They, interestingly, destroyed our mimeograph machines. And we learned, as we were preparing to eat the spaghetti that some of us had cooked in advance so we would have something to eat when we got back, they had put tacks, little nails, in the spaghetti. So I've often wondered just how many of the rebellions in the riots in the more than 100 cities, including Washington, Chicago, Baltimore, Louisville, etc., how many were encouraged by the police who wanted to demonstrate that they now knew how to control crowds of outraged people. And of course, 1968 marked a major transition in the movement. And you know, we always say civil rights movement, but in those days we tended to say freedom movement, which was a much broader concept of, you know, what that movement was striving for. And of course, one of the most dramatic examples of this transition was the sanitation workers' strike King himself was supporting in Memphis. And this was a struggle over jobs, over wages, over conditions of work. And of course, we know that Reverend James Lawson was the chairperson of the strike committee. The point I'm making is that King, as the most prominent spokesperson of that freedom movement, had clearly moved beyond a civil rights paradigm. And yet we continue to imagine that movement as only a civil rights movement. King had spoken out against the war in Vietnam in a way that resonates so powerfully with our current conditions. He had called upon his constituents, supporters, allies to link the struggles for freedom conducted by black Americans with the struggles for freedom in Vietnam, in South Africa, and other parts of what we now know as the Global South. He had also gone beyond the challenges to the laws governing segregation to challenge the economic conditions that left people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds impoverished. He was in the process, along with his colleagues in SCLC, of building a poor people's movement. They were expanding the frame beyond civil rights, and they were expanding the frame beyond the nation. Freedom movements were about more than civil rights and about more than the United States. No wonder the conspiracy theories proliferated, because both moves, beyond civil rights and beyond the national border, spelled major trouble for the government. After all, King had emerged as an important symbol of the movement. And unfortunately, now dominant discourse represents him as the only important figure of the freedom movement. But of course, there were many, many others. This freedom movement transformed individual subjects in exciting and incredible ways. Who, for example, would have thought that a black woman in Mississippi during the 1960s who had few educational opportunities, who was in fact a timekeeper on a cotton plantation, would in 1964 walk into the Democratic National Convention at the head of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and demand that their delegates be seated. Without Fannie Lou Hamer, Barack Obama is inconceivable. And I rarely hear that historical memory evoked in connection with what is seen as an unprecedented presidential election campaign. But Fannie Lou Hamer was not so much an exceptional individual as she was a woman who was willing to take the risk of becoming an agent and envoy of her people. And she was organically connected to all of those people who constituted the freedom movement, many of whom, of course, she did not know. Yesterday at a small meeting, Reverend Lawson referred to the importance of scholars and activists coming together. And I would say that 21st century scholars, activists, scholar activists need to think about what it means to build community and how community nourishes the individual, perhaps more than the individual nourishes the community. Certain insights, certain imaginations, certain aspirations and dreams elude individuals, but arise out of the ties that bind people to each other, the ties and relations that create community. And so I like to use the term communities of struggle or communities of resistance, not so much to refer to a group of individuals who bring their own individual capacities together to create a collective. I like to use these terms to point to something that is qualitatively different from the individual, a collective capacity that is so much more than the sum of individual capacities. These communities of struggle produce collective subjects. The sense of community includes those whom we do not personally know, those who do not necessarily inhabit our physical communities, those who don't necessarily live in the U.S., those who are barred from citizenship, undocumented immigrants, for example, young women workers in Asia and Africa and Central America, for example, Aboriginal people who still suffer from the still manifest and brutal racism in Australia. Even though the current Prime Minister has issued an apology to Aboriginal people not too much more than that has happened. But community, our community should embrace all of these peoples. Dr. King emphasized community, possibility of a beloved community. And the freedom movement was a palpable promise for this beloved community. And so I think that if he were around today, he would criticize the pathological hyper-individualism associated with the new conditions of neoliberalism. And of course, by conditions of neoliberalism, I'm talking about the almost total freedom of movement for capital goods services, although somehow people don't get to participate in these global flows that are praised. They are designated illegal immigrants when they, join the flow. I mean the absolute rule of the market, and all of these relatively new conditions. Of course, the rule of the market isn't new, but the extent to which it insinuates itself into all aspects of our lives. That, I think, is new, connected to the global, to what we refer to as the global capitalism that took shape in the 1980s. The diminution of public expenditures for social services, the elimination of government intervention and regulation of the market, the privatization of utilities, of services such as healthcare and education, prisons, privatization of punishment. This has emerged as the mode of increased profits for global corporations. And so the suppression of the very concept of community occurs in order to make way for the notion of individual responsibility. So this means that those who suffer from the lack of jobs or health care or education are made to bear the burden of responsibility for society's failures. Now, I would add perhaps yet another point in this brief discussion of neoliberalism, and that is the assumption, what I think of as the flawed assumption, that history does not matter. And as people like D'Souza have put it over the years, that we've now reached the end of racism. So you take Fukuyama's end of history, D'Souza's end of racism, and, well, anyway. In other words, we're now living the dream, right? If we're living the dream, that must mean that we have reached the end of history. But of course, race and racism are profoundly historical. Gender, patriarchy, misogyny are historical. Sexuality, homophobia are historical. Thus, if we discard biological or essentialist notions of race or gender or sexuality as fallacious, it would still be erroneous to assume that we can willfully extricate ourselves from those histories. And I'm focusing now on those histories of race and racism. Whether we acknowledge it or not, we continue to inhabit those histories which help to constitute our social and psychic worlds. Neoliberalism sees the market as the very paradigm of freedom, and democracy emerges as a synonym for capitalism, which has re-emerged as the telos of history. In the official narratives of U.S. history, the historical victories of civil rights are dealt with as the final consolidation of democracy in the U.S., having relegated racism to the dustbin of history. The path toward the complete elimination of racism is represented in the neoliberalist discourse of colorblindness. Equality can only be achieved when the law, and I'm aware that we are all gathered in a law school here, but when the law, as well as individual subjects, become blind to race and fail to apprehend the material and ideological work that race continues to do. And so in response to this, I would say that we urgently need more capacious meanings of racism and of anti-racism, which means, of course, that we have to be willing to give up the black-white paradigm that informed the quest for civil rights. And we can't assume that the civil rights paradigm is foundational to the very meaning of anti-racism. Neither paradigm can account, for example, for the role that colonization, genocide, particularly against indigenous people, to the role that this played in shaping U.S. racism. The historical genocide against indigenous people relies precisely on the recognition or misrecognition of indigenous people that only acknowledges them as impediments to the transformation of the landscape, impediments to be destroyed or assimilated. And within current discourse, there is in our current ways of talking about race and racism, there continues to be this invisibility of indigenous people, which is, in a sense, a kind of discursive genocide. And so differently racialized populations in the U.S., indigenous people, Latinos, Asians, more recently people of Middle Eastern and South Asian descent, have been targets of different modes of racial subjugation. Islamophobia draws on and complicates what we know as racism. Moreover, racism as it affects people of African descent is today more deeply inflected by class and gender and sexuality than we may have recognized it to be at the middle of the 20th century. And so when obvious examples of racism appear to the public, they are considered to be isolated aberrations, to be addressed as anachronistic attributes of individual behavior. There have been quite a few cases in the recent year. The noose that was hung on the tree by white students at a school in high school in Gina, Louisiana, as a sign that black students were prohibited from gathering on that tree. I can also allude to the public use of racist expletives by a well-known comedian, the racist and misogynist language employed by a well-known radio host, referring to black women on a basketball team, and finally the recent comments regarding the golfer, Tiger Woods. I just want to elaborate for a moment on this last example. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with that, right? The sports journalists who were recently involved in a conversation regarding the seemingly unstoppable Tiger Woods. And they were referring to the new, young crop of golfers who were having a hard time catching up with him. What were they supposed to do? Well, one of them says, they need to get together and gang up to stop him. And then this other journalist, Kelly Tilligman, said, they have to catch him and lynch him in a back alley. And of course, conjuring up with a single casual phrase a vast history of ruthless racist violence. Now, these comments, and all of the examples I pointed to, are readily identified as racism. They're familiar. They're exceedingly familiar. They're expressions of a kind of racism, attitudinal racism, that are now treated as anachronistic expressions of racisms that were once articulated with state-sponsored racisms, but are now relegated to the private sphere and only become public when they are literally publicized. Whereas during an earlier period in our history, such comments would have been clearly understood as linked to state policy and to the material practices of social institutions. Now they're treated as individual and private irregularities to be solved by punishing and re-educating the individual, by teaching them colorblindness, by teaching them not to notice the phenomenon of race. But if we see these individual eruptions of racism as connected to the persistence and further entrenchment of institutional and structural racism that hides behind the curtain of neoliberalism, their meanings cannot be understood as individual aberrations. In the cases we have discussed, the racism is explicit and blatant. There's no denying that these are racist utterances. What happens, however, when racism is expressed not through the words of individuals, but rather through institutional practices that are, quote, mute, to borrow a term that Dana Ann Davis uses with respect to racism. The inability to recognize the contemporary persistence of racisms within institutions and other social structures results in the attribution of responsibility for the effects of racism to the individuals who are its casualties, thus further exacerbating the problem of failing to identify the economic, social, and ideological work of racism. There is a similar logic undergirding the criminalization of these communities, which are those communities that are vastly overrepresented in jails and prisons. By failing to recognize the material forces of racism that are responsible for offering up such huge numbers of youth of color to the carceral state, the process of criminalization imputes responsibility to the individuals who are its casualties, thus reproducing the very conditions that produce racist patterns in incarceration and its seemingly infinite capacity, and the seemingly infinite capacity of the prison to expand. The misreading of these racist patterns replicates and reinforces the privatization that is at the core of neoliberalism, whereby social activity is individualized and the enormous profits generated by the punishment industry are legitimized. On February 28th, a report was published by the Pew Center for the States entitled 1 in 100 Behind Bars in America, 2008. And according to the report, on any given day, 1 out of every 100 adults in the United States of America is behind bars. 1 out of 100. And we should recall that this reflects a census on a given day, so it's not the same 1 out of 100. I mean, you may know the figure 2.3 million people behind bars, but that's a census only on a given day. A lot of times we're mystified by statistics and numbers, but if you look at how many people actually go through that system, jails and prisons, over the course of a year, it's more like 5 million, I believe. So, according to the report, for some groups, and I'm reading a quote, the incarceration numbers are especially startling. While 1 in 30 men between the ages of 20 and 24 is behind bars. For black males in that age group, the figure is 1 in 9. And black women still constitute the fastest growing sector of the imprisoned population, although women still constitute a relatively small sector of the absolute numbers. But what I want to emphasize today is that even knowing that such huge numbers of black people and people of color are locked up in jails and prisons across this country, it remains difficult to name those practices as racist. And so I want to ask, why does the word racist have such an archaic ring to it today? You know, as if those who use it are caught up in a time warp. And some of you, may be saying, oh, yeah, she's from the 60s. That's why she's talking like that. But I want to know why it is so difficult to name the crisis in imprisonment as a crisis of racism. According to the Pew report now, the U.S. incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, more people than China. There are 2.3 million adults on any given day in the U.S. system. China is second with 1.5 million adults. And when you consider the vast disparity in population, it gives you a sense of, if you look at how many people are in prison in a country like Germany, it's 93 adults for every 100,000 people. And in the U.S., it's 750 for every 100,000. And the point that I want to make is that these figures have been produced by the vastly disproportionate numbers of people of color, especially young black men behind bars. According to neoliberalist explanations, the fact that so many young black men are behind bars has little to do with race or racism, but it has everything to do with their private family upbringing, their inability to take moral responsibility for their actions. Such explanations remain mute about the social, economic, and historical power of racism. They remain mute about the dangerous work that race continues to do. The incarceration of youth of color and of increasing numbers of young women of color is not viewed as connected to the vast structural changes produced by deregulation, privatization, by the devaluation of the public good, and by the deterioration of community. Because there is no public vocabulary that allows us to place these developments within a historical context, individual deviancy becomes the overarching explanation for the grotesque rise in the numbers of people who are relegated to the country's and the world's prisons, Because racism is viewed as an anachronistic vestige of the past, we fail to grasp the extent to which the long memory of institutions, especially those that constitute the intimately connected circuit of education and incarceration, the long memory of institutions continues to permit race to determine who has access to education and who has access to incarceration. while laws have had the effect of privatizing racist attitudes and eliminating the explicitly racist practices of institutions, these laws are unable to apprehend the deep structural life of racism and therefore allow it to continue to thrive. This invisible work of racism not only influences the life chances of millions of people, it helps to nourish a psychic reservoir of racism that often erupts through the utterances of individuals and the actions of individuals, as in the cases I previously mentioned. The frequent retort made by such individuals who get caught in the act is, "I'm not a racist. I don't even know where that came from." And this question can only be answered if we're able to recognize this deep structural life of racism, which affects individuals regardless of their racial and ethnic background. And so, what I'm proposing is that agents of racism may be people of color, and are in many examples. I won't get into those examples because I only have 5 minutes left. But let me say that the deep structural racism of the criminal justice system, which I've been focusing on during the last portion of my talk, affects us in complicated ways. What we acknowledged more than a decade ago as the U.S. prison industrial complex, through which racism generates enormous profits for private corporations, what we recognized as a more or less domestic phenomenon can now be recognized as a global prison industrial complex. And this global prison industrial complex profits the world over from post-colonial forms of racism and xenophobia, with the dismantling of the welfare state, structural adjustment in the southern region required by global financial institutions, the institution of the prison, which is itself an important product marketed through global capitalism, becomes the privileged site into which surplus populations are deposited. Thus, new forms of global structural racism are emerging. The deep structural life of racism bleeds out from the U.S. criminal justice system and is having a devastating effect on the political life of the nation and the world. Since the era of slavery, racism has been associated with death. Geographer Ruth Gilmore has defined racism as, and I quote, the state-sanctioned and or legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death in distinct yet densely interconnected political geographies. The death to which Gilmore refers is multidimensional, embracing corporeal death, social death, civil death. From its advent, the institution of the prison has been organically linked to the political order of democracy in that it negatively demonstrates the centrality of individual rights and liberties. Civil life is negated, and the prisoner is relegated to the status of civil death. Although prisoners' state of civil death has now mutated so they are no longer the living dead as Colin Diane has characterized them, that is to say their residual rights have been slightly augmented, there remains a range of deprivations that situate the prisoner, and indeed the ex-prisoner, beyond the boundaries of neoliberal democracy. And so in the 2 minutes I have left, no one gave me a time You did?
Yes.
I didn't see you.
No, you didn't. I did. You did it on your own.
Yes, I gave myself a time notice because we want to have some questions and answers. So in the couple of minutes that remain, I want to look at one such deprivation, the loss of the right to vote, and would like to think about the impact of felon disenfranchisement as a byproduct of racism in the workings of U.S. democracy. In the U.S., imprisoned populations, except perhaps in the states of Vermont and Maine, lose the franchise, either temporarily or permanently. 5.3 million people have lost their right to vote, temporarily or permanently. Among black men, the figures are even more dramatic. Almost 2 million black men, or 13% of the total population of black adult men. In some states, 1 out of every 4 black men is barred from voting. The historical period, which witnessed a significant expansion of felon disenfranchisement, and I see some of the students in my seminar, Theories of Slavery, here, so we'll be talking about this process, and we have actually begun already. The expansion of felon disenfranchisement laws happened in the post-Civil War era. In fact, the 13th Amendment, which legally, and perhaps only legally, ended slavery, designated convicts as the exception, right? But the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed all persons equal protection of the law, also contained an exception. Section 2 permitted states to withdraw suffrage rights from those who were engaged in, and I'm quoting, rebellion or other crimes. Many southern states passed laws that linked those crimes that were specifically associated with black people to disenfranchisement, while those associated with white people did not result in the withdrawal of the right to vote. And therefore, in states such as Mississippi, there was the ironic situation that if you were convicted of murder, you retained your voting rights. But if you were convicted of miscegenation, you lost the right to vote. So I don't have time, of course, to develop an extended analysis of the historical development of the current practices of felon disenfranchisement. So I'll point to sociologists Jeff Manza and Christopher Eugen's findings that between 1850 and 2002, states with larger proportions of people of color in their prison populations were more likely to pass laws restricting their right to vote, which leads them to conclude, and I'm quoting, that there is a direct connection between racial politics and felon disenfranchisement. When we ask the question, they say, of how we got to the point where American practice can be so out of line with the rest of the world, they write, the only plausible answer we can supply is that of race. And so I wish to remind us all that it can be confidently argued that the Bush presidency was precisely enabled by the relegation of a large majority black population of free individuals to the status of civil death. George W. Bush won the Florida elections in 2000 by a tiny margin of 537 votes. As Congressman John Conyers has pointed out, the fact that 600,000 ex-felons were denied participation in the elections in the state of Florida alone, quote, may have literally changed the history of this nation. We might thus argue that the deep structural life of racism in the U.S. prison system gave us the president who articulated the collective fears linked to a psychic historical reservoir of racism in order to wage wars on the peoples of Afghanistan and Iraq under the guise of combating terror. Thank you very much.